I'm standing in my childhood bedroom, holding a shoebox that my stepmother Linda just handed me with trembling fingers, tears streaming down her face as she whispers, "I'm so sorry, Sarah." I had no idea. Just 30 minutes ago, she was screaming at me about how I needed to get over my mother's death and stop hoarding junk in what she now calls her house. But something she discovered in that box of photos she threw away has completely shattered her world, and mine too. The woman who spent the last 8 years making my life hell is now begging for my forgiveness, but it might be too late for both of us. You see, some secrets are buried so deep that when they finally surface, they destroy everything in their path. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because understanding how we got here requires knowing the truth about my mother's death, my father's betrayal, and the woman who slithered into our lives like a poison disguised as medicine. It was a Tuesday morning in October 2016 when my mom collapsed in our kitchen while making my favorite blueberry pancakes. The paramedics said it was a sudden heart attack, completely unexpected for a healthy 42-year-old woman. I was only 19, a sophomore at State University, and my world crumbled faster than autumn leaves hitting the ground. My father, David, seemed devastated at first, crying at the funeral, holding my hand during the service, promising we'd get through this together. But grief has a way of revealing people's true nature, and what I discovered about my father in the months that followed would haunt me forever. By Christmas of that same year, just 2 months after we laid my mother to rest, my father introduced me to Linda Walsh, a 40-year-old divorced real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. He claimed they'd met at a grief counseling group, both struggling with loss, but something about their interaction felt too comfortable, too familiar for people who'd just met. Linda had lost her husband in a car accident 3 years prior, and she played the role of the wounded widow perfectly, dabbing her eyes with tissues whenever my father's story came up. But I noticed things that made my skin crawl. The way she already knew where everything was in our kitchen, how she'd finish my father's sentences, and most disturbing of all, the way she'd study the family photos on our mantel with an expression I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't sadness or sympathy, it was something calculating, like she was taking inventory. The red flags started appearing immediately, but my father was too blinded by loneliness and, I suspected, guilt to see them. Linda would make subtle comments about how young people today don't understand real grief, how I was too dependent on my father, and how it was unhealthy for me to keep visiting my mother's grave every week. She'd volunteer to help pack away my mother's things, always with that same predatory smile, claiming she understood how difficult it must be for my father to see reminders everywhere. When I objected, she'd twist her face into a mask of hurt and whisper to my father that I was being difficult and not giving her a chance. My father, desperate to believe he'd found salvation in this woman, would take her side every single time, telling me I needed to be more understanding and let Linda help our family heal. By spring 2017, Linda had moved into our house, claiming it was temporary while she sold her condo, but I knew better. She'd systematically begun replacing my mother's things with her own: new throw pillows on the couch where my mom used to read, different artwork on the walls, even a new coffee maker because ours was outdated. Each change felt like another nail in my mother's coffin, erasing her presence from the home she'd lovingly created for 23 years. The worst part was watching my father transform into someone I didn't recognize, a man who'd apologized to Linda for my attitude and promised to talk to Sarah about being more welcoming. He'd even started calling her sweetheart, the same pet name he'd used for my mother, and the sound of it made me physically ill. The summer before my senior year of college, Linda dropped her mask completely during a family barbecue that my father had organized to introduce her to our extended family. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, had brought photo albums from my childhood, and as we sat around the patio table laughing at old memories, Linda's face grew darker with each turned page. When Carol mentioned how much I looked like my mother and how proud she'd be of the woman I was becoming, Linda's fork clattered against her plate. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the concrete, and announced in a voice dripping with false sweetness that she was tired of living in a dead woman's shadow. The entire table fell silent as she continued her rant, saying that my father needed to move forward and that constantly bringing up my mother was disrespectful to the living. My father, instead of defending his late wife or comforting his daughter, simply nodded and suggested we change the subject. That night, I lay in bed crying, finally understanding that my father had chosen Linda over his own daughter, over the memory of the woman who'd loved him unconditionally for over 2 decades. When I returned to college that fall, Linda wasted no time consolidating her power over my childhood home and my grieving father. She convinced him to sell my mother's jewelry, claiming it was just sitting there collecting dust, and that the money could be used for practical things like redecorating their bedroom. My father, who had once sworn he'd never part with my mother's wedding ring, handed over her entire jewelry box without even telling me. I only found out when I came home for Thanksgiving and discovered empty velvet-lined compartments where my mother's pearl necklace and sapphire earrings used to rest. When I confronted him, Linda appeared in the doorway like a vulture sensing carrion, placing her manicured hand on my father's shoulder and explaining in her sickeningly sweet voice that they'd discussed it as a couple and decided it was time to let go of the past. The wedding ring that had symbolized my parents' 23-year marriage was now funding Linda's shopping sprees at Nordstrom, and my father defended her right to spend their money however she saw fit. The manipulation tactics Linda employed were textbook narcissistic abuse, though I wouldn't learn those terms until years later in therapy. She'd wait until my father left for work, then call me with urgent emergencies that always somehow required me to drive the 3 hours from college to help her. Once, she claimed the basement was flooding and she needed my help moving boxes, but when I arrived, there was barely a puddle from a minor leak. Instead, she'd used my visit to go through my mother's belongings that my father had stored down there, making piles of what she deemed worth keeping versus junk that needs to go. She'd hold up my mother's favorite sweater, the soft blue cashmere one she'd worn every Christmas morning, and ask me with mock concern if I thought it was healthy for my father to hold on to reminders of sadness. When I'd protest, she'd sigh dramatically and say she was only trying to help our family move forward, then spend the rest of my visit telling my father how aggressive and unreasonable I'd been about some old clothes. The gaslighting reached its peak during my senior year when Linda began rewriting the history of my parents' marriage. She'd casually mentioned to family friends that my father had confided in her about being unhappy for years before my mother's death, painting their relationship as loveless and stagnant. She'd share fabricated stories about arguments that never happened, claiming my mother had been controlling and difficult to live with, all while positioning herself as my father's savior who'd brought joy back into his life. The most devastating part was watching my father nod along with these lies, either because he'd convinced himself they were true or because contradicting Linda had become impossible. When I'd remind him of happy memories, family vacations, anniversary celebrations, the way he used to bring my mother flowers every Friday, he'd get that glazed look in his eyes and mumble something about how people remember things differently and the past is more complicated than we think. By the time I graduated college in May 2020, Linda had successfully isolated my father from most of his old friends and my mother's family. She'd convinced him that my Aunt Carol was trying to interfere in their happiness and that his old poker buddies were stuck in the past and not supportive of his new relationship. Our house, once filled with the warmth of my mother's laughter and the sound of friends gathering for dinner parties, had become a sterile showcase for Linda's taste in home decor. She'd replaced my mother's antique dining room set with sleek modern furniture, painted over the warm yellow walls my mother had chosen with stark white, and removed every family photo that didn't include her. The few pictures of my mother that remained were relegated to my childhood bedroom, which Linda referred to as Sarah's Museum, making it clear that preserving my mother's memory was my burden alone. The breaking point came in August 2020 when my father announced, via a text message, that he and Linda were getting married in a small ceremony the following month. No discussion, no invitation to be involved in planning, just a casual announcement like he was telling me about a dentist appointment. When I called him, crying and begging him to reconsider, Linda grabbed the phone and told me that my dramatic reaction was exactly why they decided to keep it simple. She explained that they'd already been through big weddings before and didn't need the stress and complications that came with involving family members who couldn't be supportive. My father, my once strong father who used to tell me I was his princess and that no one would ever come between us, wouldn't even come back to the phone. I heard him in the background telling Linda she was handling it perfectly and that he was proud of her for being so patient with Sarah. I didn't attend their wedding, and Linda made sure everyone knew it was because I was selfish and couldn't bear to see my father happy. She posted photos on Facebook of their intimate ceremony, describing it as perfect and exactly what they wanted, with captions about new beginnings and finding love after loss. The comments from family friends who didn't know the full story praised her for bringing David back to life and congratulated them on their beautiful second chance at love. Meanwhile, I spent that September evening sitting in my small apartment, looking at photos of my parents' original wedding day, wondering how the man who'd once promised my mother he'd love her until his last breath could now be slow dancing with the woman who'd systematically erased her from their home. That night, I made a decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I would stop trying to salvage a relationship with a father who'd chosen his new wife over his own daughter's well-being. The years that followed were a masterclass in how narcissistic abuse can destroy families from the inside out. Linda had successfully driven a wedge between my father and me, but she wasn't content with just winning. She needed to ensure I stayed defeated. Every holiday became a battlefield where I was simultaneously guilt for not visiting and punished when I did show up. Christmas 2020 was particularly brutal. I arrived to find that Linda had completely redecorated the living room where my family had celebrated every Christmas morning for 19 years. Gone was my mother's collection of vintage ornaments, replaced by Linda's modern silver and gold themes that looked like something from a furniture showroom. When I asked about my mother's decorations, Linda smiled that cold smile and said they'd donated them to charity because they were outdated and didn't match the new aesthetic. My father, carving the turkey my mother used to prepare, simply shrugged and said Linda had much better taste and that the house needed updating anyway. By 2021, Linda had convinced my father to refinance the house that my mother had helped pay for with her teacher's salary for over 2 decades. She claimed they needed the equity to invest in their future together, but I suspected she was systematically extracting every bit of financial value from my family's legacy. The mortgage that my parents had nearly paid off was now extended for another 30 years, with Linda's name prominently displayed on all the paperwork. She'd also somehow convinced my father to update his will, making her the primary beneficiary of everything, including the house that should have been my inheritance from my mother. When I discovered this during a conversation with my father's lawyer, who'd been a family friend for years and was deeply uncomfortable with the changes, I realized that Linda's long-term plan was to ensure I inherited nothing from the family that had raised me. The emotional abuse escalated whenever I tried to maintain any connection with my father. Linda would intercept phone calls, claiming my father was too busy or not feeling well enough to talk, but I could hear him in the background asking who was calling. She'd schedule elaborate vacations during times she knew I was planning to visit, then post photos on social media of their romantic getaways, making sure to caption them with phrases like, "So grateful for a partner who prioritizes our relationship above all else." When I'd text my father directly, Linda would respond from his phone, claiming he'd asked her to handle his messages because my constant demands for attention were stressing him out. The woman who'd once pretended to be supportive of my relationship with my father was now actively sabotaging every attempt I made to maintain that connection. The most insidious part of Linda's campaign was how she used my mother's memory as a weapon against me. She'd make comments about how my obsession with my dead mother was unhealthy and preventing me from growing up and moving on. During one particularly vicious phone call in spring 2022, she told me that my mother wouldn't want me to be so negative and difficult, and that continuing to grieve after 5 years was self-indulgent and attention-seeking. She claimed that my father had confided in her that my mother had been worried about my emotional stability before she died, a complete fabrication that hit me like a physical blow. When I started crying and told her she had no right to speak for my mother, Linda's voice turned ice cold as she said, "I'm the woman in your father's life now, Sarah. I'm the one who takes care of him, who makes him happy, who shares his bed. Your mother is gone, and it's time you accepted that I've replaced her in every way that matters." The breaking point in our relationship came during Thanksgiving 2022, when Linda finally revealed the depth of her cruelty. I'd driven home despite knowing it would be emotionally devastating, clinging to the hope that maybe, surrounded by the holiday spirit, my father might remember who I used to be to him. Instead, I walked into a house full of Linda's friends and their adult children, a replacement family she'd curated to fill the roles that my mother's relatives and I had once occupied. During dinner, as Linda played the perfect hostess, one of her friends asked about my father's first family, and Linda launched into a performance worthy of an Oscar. She painted my mother as a troubled woman who'd struggled with depression and anxiety, claiming that my father had been emotionally exhausted from caring for someone so unstable. She described me as unfortunately taking after my mother and suggested that my father's new lease on life was evidence of how toxic his previous situation had been. I sat there in stunned silence as this woman rewrote my family's history in front of strangers, turning my loving, vibrant mother into a mentally ill burden and portraying my father as a long-suffering martyr who'd finally found happiness. The worst part was watching my father nod along, occasionally adding details that supported Linda's narrative, painting himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a man who'd chosen to betray his late wife's memory and abandon his only child. When I finally found my voice and tried to defend my mother, Linda cut me off with a patronizing smile and said, "Sarah, honey, I know this is hard for you to hear. But your father deserves to be honest about his past so we can all heal and move forward together." That night, I left their house knowing I would never voluntarily subject myself to Linda's psychological torture again, but I had no idea that she was just getting started with her campaign to erase me from my father's life completely. The final act of Linda's calculated cruelty began in March 2023, when my father was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. I only found out through my Aunt Carol, who'd heard it from a neighbor, because Linda had deliberately kept me in the dark about his condition. When I called the house, frantic with worry, Linda answered with that familiar tone of false concern and told me that my father had specifically requested that I not be told because my tendency toward drama would interfere with his healing process. She claimed they'd already consulted with the best oncologists and had everything under control, making it clear that my presence was neither wanted nor needed. The woman who'd stolen my father was now using his illness as the ultimate weapon to keep me away during what could have been his final months, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. For 6 months, I lived in agony, not knowing if my father was responding to treatment, if he was scared, or if he even wanted to see me before he potentially died. Linda had blocked my number from their landline and convinced my father to do the same with his cell phone, cutting off my last avenue of direct communication with the man who'd raised me. Every attempt I made to reach out through mutual friends or family members was met with the same response. Linda had told everyone that I was harassing them during my father's time of need, and that my selfish behavior was making his recovery more difficult. She'd painted me as an unstable daughter who couldn't respect boundaries, and people who'd known me my entire life began to believe her version of events. The isolation was so complete that I started to question my own memories, wondering if maybe I really was the problem, if maybe my grief had made me unreasonable and difficult to love. The breakthrough came in September 2023, when my father's cancer went into remission and Linda decided it was time to complete her mission of erasing every trace of my mother from their lives. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, to inform me that they were finally ready to clear out the last of my mother's belongings and that I had 1 week to come collect anything I wanted before everything went to Goodwill. She made it sound like a generous offer, giving me the opportunity to rescue my mother's possessions, but I knew it was really a power play designed to force me back into their toxic dynamic one final time. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I agreed to come that Saturday, knowing this might be my last chance to save whatever remained of my mother's memory. When I arrived at the house that Saturday morning, Linda was waiting for me with boxes of my mother's things stacked in the garage, like garbage ready for disposal. 24 years of my mother's life had been reduced to a dozen cardboard boxes that Linda had obviously gone through first, keeping anything of monetary value and leaving me with the sentimental junk she deemed worthless. My mother's photo albums, her recipe collection written in her distinctive handwriting, her college textbooks, and her collection of ceramic angels were all there, but conspicuously missing were her jewelry, her good china, and the antique quilt her grandmother had made. When I asked about these items, Linda shrugged and said they'd already been donated or accidentally thrown away during spring cleaning, her eyes glittering with satisfaction at my obvious pain. The most devastating moment came when Linda handed me a shoebox that she claimed contained the last of the photos that hadn't already been sorted through. She stood there watching me with barely concealed glee as I opened the box, expecting to find precious memories of my mother that I could preserve. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. Dozens of photographs that Linda had clearly taken in secret, documenting every moment of my parents' marriage that she could twist into evidence of unhappiness. Pictures of my mother looking tired after a long day of teaching, my father appearing distracted during a family gathering, moments captured and collected like ammunition for Linda's campaign to rewrite history. But at the bottom of the box, beneath these stolen moments, I found something that Linda had overlooked in her haste to hurt me, something that would finally give me the power to destroy the woman who destroyed my family. Hidden beneath the photographs was a small manila envelope containing documents that my mother had apparently kept secret for years, medical records showing that she'd been seeing a cardiologist for months before her death, correspondence with a lawyer about updating her will, and most shocking of all, a private investigator's report dated just 2 weeks before she died. The report contained surveillance photos and detailed evidence proving that my father had been having an affair with Linda Walsh for over 6 months before my mother's sudden heart attack. There were pictures of them together at restaurants, entering hotel rooms, and embracing in parking lots, all time-stamped and documented with the thoroughness of a professional investigation. My mother had discovered my father's betrayal and was preparing to divorce him when the stress of his infidelity had literally broken her heart, triggering the cardiac event that killed her. Linda hadn't met my father at grief counseling after my mother's death. She'd been the reason for my mother's death all along, and my mother had died knowing that the man she'd loved for over 2 decades had chosen another woman over their marriage and family.